Hi, I'm Jake Kercheval, Director of Sales and Marketing for ServiceShare, a subsidiary of the Iowa Hospital Association and the 2020 Governance Forum's general sponsor. ServiceShare provides Iowa hospitals with carefully selected business partnerships to make important decisions easier, more efficient, and more economical. It is my pleasure to introduce the next speaker. Margaret Sumption is a senior partner at Sumption and Weiland, which provides governance development, strategic planning, training, and coaching services for business, nonprofit, and government sectors. In this session, Margaret will share with us her insight into how to transition CEO leadership and how to plan for change.
Nothing is more embarrassing to a board member than to have someone point at them and say, you're in the weeds and you need to get out of the weeds and get into strategy. What in the world does that mean? That's why we're here today, is to talk about how to stay out of the weeds and how to make sure we're measuring blue sky effectively. One of the things that's most important that we have to engage and really align is that governance really matters. Governance is an incredibly important part of the functionality of any entity, and critically important to the overall effectiveness and mission fulfillment of our hospitals and health systems. And in small communities, we count on governance to be the eyes and ears of the community, to be the leaders, the strategists, the visionaries who set course. But there's more to good governance than just compliance. And we often find that boards of directors are looking toward compliance as, okay, are we ticking off all the boxes? And sometimes we become more engaged in ticking off the boxes instead of really doing the right work for the organization. One of the things that we find is that boards are often one of the most underperforming assets of our organization. And I use that word asset very, very specifically because you are an asset. Board members individually and boards as a whole are partners in mission fulfillment. And we want to make sure that board members understand the critical nature of being a part of the partnership for effective governance. And I think the most important element here is there has to be a frank and open relationship that really sets the stage for governance excellence. And when we find ourselves, unfortunately, and boards do sometimes, working really hard but doing the wrong work, it's often because we haven't been upfront and engaged in the process. We haven't been intentional. And sometimes being intentional means bringing up things that are uncomfortable, identifying those elements that are necessary for effective engagement. Because to be engaged and be fully active in our structural element is really a critical recipe for success as we move forward. I'd like to just demonstrate here a little bit how I look at the world when I think about the role of the board and the role of the executive. And when I use that word, the executive, that could be both the executive and leadership team, and however that functionality of the element of the administration and executive and execution levels of the partnership process. The board sits above the line. The executive and executive team sit below the line. The most important element here is to draw the line. It's critically important that boards of directors and their executive really have a frank and open dialogue about what is the board's work and what is the work of the execution team, that team that is executing on the strategy set for the organization and implementing those structures. We know that this partnership has a kind of an ebb and flow to it. and that sometimes, the executive will, and the leadership team will come up into the board's work a little bit to assure compliance and other elements, or to address issues of concern that maybe need to be identified. And frankly, it is appropriate occasionally for the board to come down into the work of the organization and understand it, align with it, be a part of it, and then ultimately get in and then get out. That line is where you set it. And that line is different for every single organization. I had a most interesting experience just the other day working with a board of directors, and they were looking at their structures and processes. And it was interesting to see that they were talking about, well, how do we move forward? How do we get a new board member seated into our organization? Well, that executive and leadership team was providing some very critical and important support. It's the board's work to reconstitute itself if you have a board that self-perpetuates. But sometimes it's really important just to let that happen. And it also depends on where you're at as an organizational entity. Because small and emerging hospitals often will have that line be a little bit lower, where the board does take on maybe a little bit more of the operational engaged work of the organization. And sometimes the board is a little bit more directly involved. And I often see that when I work with very small hospitals, or I work with hospitals that are in transition in some way, that we'll see the board take on a little heftier role, and the executive functions role will be a little less, and the board will engage a little bit more heavily. The problem is not that the line is wrong. It's that the line is not set. But it's critically important that the movement and the flow of that work will ultimately have some movement, but that it's the responsibility for us to understand if we're crossing the line, to know that we're doing it, acknowledge it, frame it, and also then communicate around that. Now, for very, very large hospitals, or I say very, very larger hospitals and health systems, we often see the role of governance really in the pipeline is really very thin, and it's very much policy-directed partnership, where there's more high levels on strategy, but very, very low process levels. And that's okay. But again, the ebb and flow is there. It's a little bit less, but there is shared responsibility for mission and a continuous strategic alignment moving forward. So the key is not that the line is in the wrong place. The key is that you have not, as a team, defined the line. And then there is one other critical element that I would be remiss if I didn't just give you a little reminder of, and that's the importance of understanding the core fiduciary duties of an organization. That duty of care, and these are fundamental to boards and executives working in partnership for execution of mission, that you do exercise in every single decision and every single process, you exercise a duty of care. What would a prudent person do? How would a prudent person move forward? And how in a like position or similar circumstances, what would be the effective and most important exercise of responsibilities as an organizational fiduciary? We often hear the word fiduciary and we think money. And yes, it's about money, but it's about much more. It's about the duty of loyalty, understanding the faithful execution of the duties of the role of board member, and faithful execution of the role and duties of the executive and that executive's leadership team as they integrate in the implementation of the work. That is undivided allegiance to the organization first. that personal allurement, personal preferences, personal wishes and ideas are set aside for the duty of loyalty to the organization. And it's not to use any information that is gained for personal gain. That's a critical element of that duty of loyalty. These are the things that makes a governance board be acting where they need to be, which is up into the sky of mission fulfillment. That you're not down in the weeds, that you're not pushing a particular agenda for that agenda's sake. You are truly exercising a duty of loyalty to the organization first. And then very importantly, that mission absolutely has to be the first and foremost agenda of any action of any individual person, whether they sit as a board member, and any individual person as they sit as an executive for your organization. That to never act in conflict with the goals of the organization. And I remind you of this because it really is a framework for asking the question, are we practicing our fiduciary duties as a board? And are we working collaboratively in the implementation of mission? One of the strategies that I think is probably one of the most powerful, and I just happened to the other night see this. I was sitting in a board meeting on Zoom. I was not at the physical board meeting, and this was the first meeting the board had come together after being completely separated during the COVID initial stages, and now we're coming together socially distanced, and we're in a large room, and I'm coming in by Zoom. And I of course was prepared and was sitting in the Zoom conference when the board meeting started. The first actions of the board chair were these: a reminder of the fiduciary duties as an organization and as individual board members and individual staff members to the organization. And the second thing that they identified was a statement of mission and values. And that statement of mission, and they also included the vision, the statement of mission, vision, and values. Just a little reminder that keeps us out of the weeds and keeps us in the upper levels of operation and work. And the critical nature of understanding that that's an important framework, and that if we come into every board meeting with that framework front and center, we will be less likely to get down in the weeds and be working on the wrong work. We'll be more likely to stay in the organizational vision, mission implementation, mission accountability, and outcomes framework that is the true work of the board. And we will then leave the partnership of execution of that mission and those vision elements and those specific goals and responsibilities. We will be leaving that to our leadership team and partnering effectively to do that. I would say it was one of the most powerful elements I've seen of a board starting out with their brain in the right place. We're doing our fiduciary duty. We understand it. We know what our vision and mission are. We know what our values are, and we are ready to move forward with understanding what is the strategy behind making sure our mission is fulfilled. I think the first element that I want to talk about is that you got to talk about it. You can't just align that we're going to do the right thing. It's just assumed, we know what that nasty definition that some of us use about when we assume something, that we're probably going to be wrong. Transparency is the hallmark of effective governance. We need to talk about what our job is. We need to talk about what our roles are. We need to remind ourselves of our fiduciary duties. What is our mission? Why are we here today? What are the ultimate vision the ultimate vision we want for our organization? And then ultimately, how do we want that vision to come to life in the form of objectives, meeting the needs of patients, meeting the needs of our community, being supportive in mission fulfillment. And we can't do that without talking to each other. And that means sometimes having difficult and uncomfortable, even sometimes, conversations. I think when I'm asked to come in to work with a board that's having difficulty or challenges with each other, often this is the first thing that I see, that we simply don't talk about the elephant in the room. We simply don't talk about the breach of duty that someone has essentially presented to the organization. We simply are shy about being clear in what is the right thing to do. I think one of the hallmarks of my work in consultation and work with boards of directors has been this statement: we make rules when we're happy, so we can implement them when we're not. And if we do that, we will then keep ourselves out of the weeds and keep ourselves up in the important and appropriate work of the governance structure. If you have high communication transparency, you're willing to talk about tough subjects, you're already on your way to being an excellent board. And if you're calling yourselves out when you're not fulfilling that transparency, you are also on the way to being a highly functioning and effective board. The second element that keeps us out of the weeds is to understand our partnership. The executive and the leadership team have a critical responsibility for executing on the ground day to day that vision and those values and those goals that you have as a board of directors have put together. Understanding and valuing that partnership. I make the comment often to board chairs that, you only get to be the boss and be the supervisor of your CEO for about 2 hours a year. And that's the 2 hours you do your performance appraisal. The rest of the time, it's a partnership. It's a back and forth, a highly aligned, integrated partnership. That is a partnership with the board chair as the leader of the board, and then ultimately with each and every board member, and then collectively with the board as a whole. We are in this together. If we understand that and we have a common sentiment, a positive sentiment, that we each have responsibilities, and each of those responsibilities go to a singular goal of mission fulfillment, we will be well on our way to being a high-level partnership, which means we're well on our way of being an excellent board because we understand and honor those partnership roles. And frankly, if we step on each other's toes once in a while, that we say, oops, I stepped on your toe, I'm sorry, let's figure this out, let's put a rule together so we try not to make that happen ever again. And we're acknowledging it, we're accepting it, and we're moving forward with it. We are accountable to ourselves as a board, and we're accountable to our organization as a partnership moving forward. The next critical element is that of inquiry. We have to be willing to have the difficult conversations. We have to move forward assertively and yet be highly cooperative. And we can do that as individual board members. I believe that one of the I often refer to it as shyness. As a board member, you walk into the boardroom and you sit down and you probably have a packet that's really big we'll talk about that a little bit. But your packet is big, it's complex. There's a little bit of anxiety that comes along with reading the financials and saying, oh my gosh, I've been doing this for a whole year and I still don't understand them. I'm not really certain if I align with, how we're moving forward or the timing of we're moving forward. We have to be willing to ask questions and not allow ourselves as individual board members to stay silent. One of my rules when I do training of board chairs, new board chairs will often seek an orientation about how to be a good board chair. And I tell them your first job is to never let a board meeting go by that everyone has not spoken. And making sure that every single person around the table has had an opportunity to speak on key and critical issues, that we teach board members to speak up by encouraging them to speak up from the chair's seat, and that we can create that culture of inquiry within our board by providing leadership tools to do that. And one of the defaults often that happens that causes boards to kind of shutter down a little bit and become kind of silent and go for entire board meetings where only maybe one or two speak up, but not everybody speaks up. And that's, we teach people how to do that because our board meetings might be set up in a manner that are aligned with, a whole bunch of people telling us stuff as board members. They're telling us all kinds of stuff, but we're not having an opportunity to have dialogue, inquiry about it. And so how we set up our board meetings can either impede or encourage a culture of inquiry. And so it's a wonderful tool. And I'd encourage board chairs, if they're coming close to the end of the meeting and you've got Martha sitting down at the far end of the table, you say, Martha, we haven't heard from you. What are your three biggest concerns about as we move forward on these topics? What are the things that we should be asking ourselves? And really encourage, solicit, and frame a culture of inquiry within your board meeting. As you discuss elements, it is that culture of inquiry that keeps you out of the weeds of being worried about, the price of toilet paper, and I have a story about that, and really gets us involved in the big picture of how are we best delivering healthcare in our community. What does our community want, need, desire, and how can we most effectively move forward with that? And oh, by the way, my toilet paper story, I had the opportunity, and this is now quite a few years ago, maybe about 12 years ago, I was sitting in a board meeting doing a board assessment. And part of that board assessment was for me to sit in on the board meeting and just watch them work. And it was interesting because this board had a very strong finance committee. The finance committee had gone through their work and had, in a detailed fashion, had reviewed the finance report, and that report of the finance was coming to the full board for information, analysis, and ultimately adoption and recognition of the report per the recommendation of the finance committee. So this sounds really good, right? Everything's going exactly the way it's supposed to go. Well, then it turned sideways a little bit. All of a sudden, someone spoke up and said, look at this line item on page 17 of the financials. Okay, red flag number one. Page 17 of the financials, we spent $14,848 last month on paper supplies. Why is that? And all of a sudden, the review of a finance report went from review and affirmation and acknowledgement to a 20-minute, I kid you not, I took notes, a 20-minute conversation about the price of paper products, which included toilet paper, by the way. And so it can go south so easily when we're not paying attention. But there was another element here that was at play. That full board had the entire, I believe the size of the financial report was 28 pages. The full board had the full 28-page report instead of an effective dashboard. And because they had this deep report, it gave people permission to dive into the details. Here we are, down in the weeds. I was critical. I was critical and said, you're way down in the weeds. You're doing the wrong work. And in reality, the work had already been done by the finance committee. And so it should have been stopped. It should have not happened, but it never should have happened because the full board should see your dashboards and your summary reports, and it's your finance committee that should be asking, maybe, I'm not even sure about that, maybe the price of toilet paper. That culture of the board is really critical. And this is really what I'm talking about, is kind of how do we do things around here? By the way, that's my definition of culture. You know, we've had a lot of conversation about that word, and how do we set a good work culture, a good board culture, and it's really the refined dance of policy, practice, and strategy. And when we are, as a board, we kind of set the cadence of that dance, and we align with kind of how we do things around here in the boardroom. And it comes along with time and engagement and process, but it really is critical to understand that that culture can either be a culture that's up, looking up and out, or it can be a culture of reactive, looking down and inside. And that's the difference between weeds and blue sky. If your culture honors your work by looking down deep, looking at the detail, spending 75% of your time talking about money you've already spent instead of 75% of your time talking about opportunities, impact, investments that you're going to move forward in the future, it's hard to call yourself a blue sky board as opposed to one that's in the weeds. And this happens over time. It isn't something that just happens, that we just choose or fail to choose. We get into habits over time. So if you find yourself getting a little bit too engaged in the detail, or praise be, having 100-page packets that are coming with your, in your board packet every month, and that instead of having the high level analyzed information brought to you in the form of dashboards and things like that, it takes time to get out of that old culture and into a new culture. And so it does require, we'll go right back to the beginning, transparency. Is this working? If it's not working, what do we need to define our dance a little differently to make sure that we are at our highest level, looking at policy, at systems, at opportunities, at the big picture of the work, instead of diving into the detail of past work, past structure, past performance, and past strategy, and really looking at a reactive level. Culture evolves over time, and culture changes over time with intentional practice. And that means we need to take the long view. And this word strategy has gotten a lot of attention over the while, and I think even attention to the point that people say, I'm enough about the word strategy. What does that really mean? Well, really, it really means, are we always looking at outcomes? Are we looking at the broad impact of what we are seeking for the future? Are we keeping our hearts, our minds, our activities, and our actions on things that move us toward a proactive futures structure? Are we looking up and out versus down and in? And if you really step out of your board meeting after you're done and you say, boy, we spent a lot of time looking in and down and not very much time looking up and out, well, that would be an indication that your board needs to be taking the long view and looking more toward the outcomes of your organization than the internal elements of back and forth about things that are already done, very minute policies, minute practices that are really work and important work for the executive team as they execute on your vision and on your strategy, as opposed to your crafting those, shaping those, and then being the accountability agent, which is not your job at the execution level. Your job is to measure outcomes and seek understanding about the best ways to deliver on mission. I'm reminded of a story that, and again, this is a story quite a while ago, a board of directors that was really already a very highly functioning board. And, you know, high functioning boards often ask themselves really hard questions. And so they asked me to do a 2-hour facilitated conversation. It's exactly how they described it, where they were getting together in a small retreat and they were doing some other things, but they wanted to spend 2 hours saying, what kind of a board do we want to be? And it was a rousing dialogue and lots of very highly engaged and involved board members speaking up and giving their point of view about what kind of a board do we want to be. And many of them talked about, we want to be talking about the future. We want to be looking to accountabilities. We want to be setting strategy. We want to be setting the future of how we meet the needs of our community. We want to be out and about in the community, seeking the understanding of what our community needs for us to be better. And finally, one board member, and he happened to be a bank president and a very, just a very dynamic and bold and a willing, active, engaged member of the board. He says, you know what, may I speak? And he actually stood up, and I remember this so vividly. He actually stood up and he said, you know, I'm really tired of people telling me as a board member that I'm down in the weeds. I don't like it when people say that to me. But I believe that sometimes I get shoved down in the weeds because people give me detail. And I will tell you, if you give me detail, I will think in detail. If you give me big picture, I'll think in big picture. And what a powerful statement to say that, and this is my admonishment for you CEOs in the room and leadership team members. Make sure you're giving high-level information. Make sure you're giving proactive information that sets a future understanding, as opposed to 28 pages of financials that tell you about the price of toilet paper. If you give people detail, if you give boards detail, they will think in detail and they will react in detail. So don't set them up for failure and for criticism of being down in the weeds. And it was really a powerful statement and really resulted for that board of directors the building of several dashboards that they utilized to model to say, are we on track when they did their accountability measures each month? Are we on track to budget? Are we on track to program? Are we meeting needs of the community? Are we indeed addressing our mission, our vision? Are we paying attention and holding ourselves accountable to our values, and are our outcomes consistent with a model that we've chosen for ourselves? Because it's really the responsibility of the board to set a continually refined measure of what the desired future is. If you keep your heart and your mind as a board member on looking up and out, you will see yourselves as a board that is doing the right work. You are doing the right work by always asking questions. Okay, that's how it looked last month. What does that tell us about how we need to be looking forward to next year? And nothing is more powerful than this understanding at a time of complete disruption, of virtually every aspect of the healthcare world. And right on top of it, every aspect of our own lives, personally, professionally, as well as our role on the board or our role as an executive in a hospital and health system as we're attempting to deliver high quality care. The whole world is disrupted. And it becomes even more important that boards of directors focus on a desired, refined future. Even though we know very clearly that that future is very much altered by all of these elements that are currently happening. But it does not have to measure failure. It can measure a newly refined understanding of success, and that boards that are paying attention to keeping their eyes up and out on the vision we want for our healthcare system, up and out on the mission we are fulfilling every single day, that we will then refine and continually refine that desired future. And we will not be down in the weeds trying to sort out, what do we save? How do we cut? How do we cut? How do we shrink in to be successful? We'll be instead saying, what are our opportunities? What are our opportunities for partnership? What are our opportunities for engagement with other systems? What are our opportunities in moving forward in order to be better and ready for the next step of our structured elements together? So really creating that vision and paying attention to that vision will get us much farther toward the outcomes and much farther, frankly, to being a board that is contributing as a key fundamental visionary partner, and that is the role and your fiduciary role that you play as you align with your executive to carry out the vision you are continually refining and changing. You know, it really has created a bit of an upheaval as well to strategic planning because all those wonderful strategic plans that we put together, are we indeed able to execute them given the current lay of the land, that we need to continually refine and be nimble in that process. But very importantly, you have to come to the board table with your authentic self. You have a responsibility to speak up. You have a responsibility to speak proactively. You as individual board members cannot simply play the role of being the bad cop trying to catch people doing something wrong. If you find that you're in that kind of frame, that's really an integrity statement you need to ask yourself as individual board members. Am I really down in the weeds because I feel my job is to watch out, to protect, to save, to restrict? Or is it my job to look forward, to look up, to look out with opportunity? And that really is what creates the integrity of an individual board member. And then the integrity of the board as a whole, holding yourselves accountable to each other as well. Because as you deliver your authentic self, that means when you see others not presenting in a meaningful way, that's critical for you to look to the entire organization. And I'll go back to that important word: be transparent, be ready to speak up, be ready to be a part of the integrity of the full board, that we are doing the right work in the right way with the right objective. And our right objective as a board of directors is to lead and set vision and set understanding and hold accountable ourselves and our organizations to the implementation of mission, following the fiduciary duties, and always making the decisions that will assure that we have the highest integrity, that we have managed any conflicts of interest, because we know in small towns, small communities, that happens. We're going to see conflicts, that we're holding ourselves accountable first, but that we're also holding ourselves also with accountability, because It's, we're standards for all and all, and all for standards here moving forward. That we want and understand the importance that we hold ourselves accountable first. Then we hold our leadership and our leadership accountable. And our leadership, frankly, I don't want this to be a one-sided conversation. Our leadership team needs to hold the board accountable as well. And that requires that we have a deep commitment to putting a set of standards in place, putting a rule book in place, and then holding all of ourselves accountable to that rule book of understanding and outcomes. Accountabilities also has another little bit of blue sky opportunity there as well. We're holding ourselves accountable to the big strategic priorities, but we're staying out of the how. We're setting the why. The why is what is mission. We're setting the accountabilities, the outcomes, and the impact, but we're staying out of the how. And when I say stay out of the how, the execution of the work between here is our strategic priority, here is the outcome we desire, that it is the responsibility of your leadership team, you're led by your CEO, to actually frame the specific steps that get you toward that accountability. Your job is to hold people accountable. Your job is not to tell them how to do their work, but to seek to understand that they are working in an accountable way toward the step-by-step process toward the accountability that you demand. And as a board member, that is your key responsibility, is to set the mission, align the vision of the organization, make sure the values of the organization are front and center, the touch point of everything that we do. And then ultimately to have that set of outcomes. What are the outcome measures that will say that we are working toward a strategic outcome and a strategic goal? And then how are we holding ourselves accountable? And this is ourselves as a total organization. This is not about who wins and who loses. This is only about we only win together. And that's because we need to have ownership with each other. Holding yourself to a standard is one thing, but holding ourselves to a collective standard is that collective ownership. And collective ownership, and I mean that to include the CEO and executive team as they act as your implementation specialists, and the board as the vision and strategic and outcomes setters, if you will, that you hold yourself collectively to a high standard. But you can't hold yourself and own that standard collectively unless each of you as individual board members own that standard individually. And owning that standard means that, sometimes there are people who like going down in the weeds and want to understand all the nits and grits about, well, how are you doing it? And why are you doing it that way? And why wouldn't this be a better way? That individual behavior can indeed impede the board as a whole from doing it well. So, spoiler alert here, your board is only as good as its collective understanding about roles and responsibilities and staying engaged in those roles and responsibilities in a meaningful way. And then ultimately holding ourselves accountable and holding each other accountable when we're not. But we can't really know how to do it unless we learn about it and talk about it and align with it. So we need to be ready to work to get it right at the next level. One of the things that I always talk about is that boards of directors are always in some stage of change. They are always either growing and evolving or diminishing and devolving. They rarely just stay the same on an ongoing basis. And so it's important to periodically ask yourself, are we doing the work right? and what is right at the next level. And we can only do that with continuous learning. And that's exactly why you're in this experience today, why you attend the governance conferences, why you take part in evaluating yourself as a board, and at least annually kind of doing a little bit of a scorecard, if you will, about how you're doing. How are your board meetings working? Well, very importantly, how am I as an individual board member doing as a board member? Am I holding up my end? And then collectively, how are we implementing on the responsibilities and accountabilities of a highly functioning organizational board? And so if we don't ask ourselves and measure ourselves occasionally, we won't know whether or not we're on the right path. I liken it a little bit to that nasty experience I have every fall when it's time for me to go for my regular annual checkup. I'm lucky enough that I'm probably one of the minimal users of the healthcare systems. And so when I go, what's the first thing they make me do when I walk in down the hallway on my way to that important annual checkup? Let's just let you step up there on the scale and see how you're doing. And oh my goodness, what a gut check. What a reality check, because I've managed to stay off the scale for an entire year. Something I did for myself only for my own personal mental health. But if you think about it from a board standard, how do we know we're getting fat? How do we know we're losing weight, not doing it right, if we don't periodically assess ourselves? But then very importantly, we have to also do something about it. When we find that, oh, you know what, we're down in the weeds on a few of these issues, we really need to get ourselves moving up to that next level. We really need to do some board education and board learning, going out and finding it. And as you do your succession planning and build your leadership succession, and as that new board chair comes in, board chairs, I'm speaking directly to you now. Board chairs, you have a very important responsibility in setting the tenor and tone for your board of directors. You have a responsibility to be optimistic, to be forward thinking, to engage people, to reach out to people, even if they haven't called you, not to simply be reactionary, but be proactive in working with individual board members to help them be successful, to sit at a board meeting well prepared, to make sure that your board agenda, that you and your executive or however you structure the agenda for for your regular monthly board meetings, that in that process that you've labeled your items as this is an information item, this is a discussion item, this is an action item that we're going to have, and make your board agenda, including your consent agenda elements, and make your board meeting kind of clip and move fast and move in a vibrant and meaningful way. And you know what? If it's a discussion item and it says discussion item on your agenda, then you call out each individual board member and you ask them, be a part of discussion. That's part of that continuous learning opportunity. You can actually do it just in the context of each individual board meeting and setting the stage in that board meeting process. I think probably the next element on that I often people kind of look at that and they go, really, celebration. We have to celebrate with each other. I think if this COVID outbreak and kind of the sequestering of ourselves in our homes and going to these electronic meetings and all of this, we're not celebrating very well together because we can't be together. We have to find ways to celebrate success. We have to share successes with each other. We have to recognize each other. I'm a complete believer that ceremony is critically important. To me, one of the most powerful ceremonies is handing over the gavel from one board chair to the next board chair, the euphemistic moving of the gavel from one person to the next person, and celebrating the successes of leadership for the chair, and then anticipating the leadership for the incoming chair. Passing the baton is a critical element because it says to the entire board, we are moving forward, we're moving up in our processes. Instead of being reactionary, being proactive in setting our succession planning so that we have some cadence and understanding of someone who's going to be coming into leadership so that they can prepare themselves. People who are going out of leadership so they understand how their role is evolving. Each board member periodically, again, that annual evaluation of themselves and the board meeting itself and also the board structure. Critical, because then we can celebrate. We're getting better this year. We're doing better. We're staying in an accountability frame and not allowing ourselves to go down in the weeds too much, but staying in an opportunity. And then very importantly, giving us that opportunity to acknowledge each other and acknowledge opportunities. And in our world, there's not enough celebration, I believe. We often get together for a lot of really bad reasons. We see it on national TV, people getting together for a march. How about if we get together for something positive occasionally as well, or to celebrate the life of another person, just like we celebrate a marriage by attending a wedding. We celebrate a christening and a new birth of a baby with a christening and a ceremony of that type. Or we celebrate the loss of a person by attending and grieving at a funeral. These are all celebrations. Our society has changed a lot, and we don't do those celebrations as often. I challenge you that to be a board that is really looking up and out, you are also a board who is taking time to celebrate with each other. I want to take a moment just to align with you. This is an orchestral design of a board organizational chart. Now, I don't know if you have a board organizational chart, but I'm a complete believer in them. And I happen to have created this orchestral design for it was a mid-sized hospital, about 60 beds in northern Minnesota. And it has been so powerful for them and so helpful for them because it puts the board of directors as the key elements of the audience of why their organization exists. They are the spokespeople for all the community members and patients and all the people who would be in an audience that is a part of a healthcare organization. And ultimately, the importance, and I want to take your eyes to the left-hand side as you see that governance responsibility, that you have an entity of your board specifically defined with board roles and responsibilities, board recruitment and nomination, succession planning. Whether you're a governmental board that elects its board or you are a self-perpetuating board that is calling board members forward, have a process, have a structure, have good board orientation, have some entity of the board responsible for saying, we're evaluating ourselves. What kind of a board do we want to be? And what board education, board learning opportunities do we want? And how do we recognize individual board members and set a standard of behavior so that we hold each other accountable? I had a board member say to me, he said, well, we've got this board member, he only comes once every 5 or 6 months, but, and our bylaws are specific that if you don't show up for 3 meetings that you probably need to get a letter and all that, but we don't do any of that. You need standards and you need to hold yourselves accountable to them. So I want to just frame that for this particular organizational group, they have 4 committees. They have an executive committee, key responsibilities. You'll notice they're quite lean, but they're clearly there. And quality, front and center. Finance to the right. And this functional element creates a visual picture of who they are. I found it really, really helpful because what it says to a board of directors is that we are We understand visually how we look and how we work together. And I don't know, it just creates, well, it creates an opening for conversation, an opening for transparency, an opening for setting standards of behavior, an opening for setting accountability. It's all the things that we've talked about in this session about how to keep ourselves up and out as opposed to down in the weeds. Because we never want to have anyone criticize us for being a board that's down in the weeds, micromanaging. And the only way we can do that is by our own behavior. I kind of have a little bit of my top 5 here. These are kind of my top 5 tips. Make rules when you're happy so you can implement them when you're not. You know, when you see a board member acting egregiously, breaking, having a conflict of interest and not being willing to recognize that and step away, that's not the time to write a policy about conflict of interest. The time to write it is when you're happy. The time to evaluate it is when you're happy, because when you're not, you're going to need to fall back to it. It's kind of like playing a Monopoly game. We never get out the rule book until someone's trying to steal Boardwalk. We have to invest in a strong board. And I encourage you to encourage board leadership participation, encourage board education. Spend a few of your resources on being a better board. We would never want to fail to invest in a critical element of helping our hospital and health system be successful. And that means helping yourselves to be self-sustained and self-disciplined. And that takes an investment. It's also about, I'm a complete believer in this, keep it skinny. Don't have more rules than you need. Don't have a lot of structures and processes and things you can't remember. Keep it lean. Less is more. But let that less be absolutely tantamount. We are going to be 100% compliance with our set of rules, our structures, and our process. And we have to demand at least annual assessment. Accountabilities coupled with clear direction is a must-have and sets the stage for all 12 elements of looking up and out, of transparency, a culture of inquiry, the importance of integrity, the importance of being personally accountable, of setting a culture of personal accountability and also group accountability as a board of directors, making sure that you are a part of always continuous quality improvement. And then ultimately, bring your leadership team along. Make sure that your leadership team and your board are seeing themselves collaboratively as partners together, working together for a better outcome. And so I leave you today with that understanding that if someone ever criticizes you that you're in the weeds, you can say, we're looking up and out. We are a board that is accountable, that is engaged, that is involved, and continuously learning. Thank you very much for your time today. Good luck in good board service. Take care.